Hello, and welcome to our webinar today on ISDA initial margin documentation, focusing on the regime table and strictest of rules. This is part of a series of webinars that ISDA is doing on recently published initial margin documentation. My name is Mark New. I'm Senior Counsel for the Americas at ISDA, and I'm joined today by Ryan Patino, who's a partner at Teagle & Hunt. So why do we use the approach of regimes in these initial margin documents? Well, this recognizes a couple of features of the initial margin regulations. First of all, the documentation is typically required to allow the parties to collect and post the initial margin that they are required to collect and post under the applicable regulations. So one of the tasks for the documentation is to take those regulatory requirements and turn them into contractual rights and obligations. So, in a sense, an approach could be to simply say that the parties will comply with applicable law. However, that wouldn't be a very clear statement of the rights and obligations of the parties under the contract, and so it's desirable to provide some additional specificity. But on the other hand, in particular because the initial margin requirements have a cross-border element, and so it's quite possible that more than one initial margin regime could apply to a counterparty pairing, it could become very complicated to draft out all of the specific terms that the parties might need or be allowed to have in order to comply with any particular combination of initial margin requirements. So the approach that's embodied in the documents is sort of a middle approach between those two extremes, where the parties specify the regimes in the documentation that will apply to that relationship, but then the specific requirements are then dictated by the regulatory content of those regimes. And that will determine, as we will see, things like the transactions that are covered under that CSA, and, for example, the haircuts or the minimum haircuts that have to be applied to collateral posted as initial margin. So this gives specificity as to which regime's rules are included within the contractual framework and essentially converted into contractual rights and obligations. And it also, in the CSA, contains rules that govern the interaction of multiple sets of margin requirements where the parties are subject to multiple regimes. And in today's presentation, we're going to be looking at how the parties can specify those regimes and what some of the consequences are under the documents of specifying those regimes in your CSA. So that's what I want to say in terms of a background. Ryan, I'll hand over to you to start talking about how we complete the regime table.
Thanks, Mark. So I'll jump right in. As Mark mentioned, this is a completely new concept that is included in the IMCSA. This regime table doesn't exist in other ISDA published documentation. And the idea behind this is to complete the regime table to specify those regimes that apply to a particular counterparty pairing. So quite simply, what we would be doing is determining which regimes apply and specifying them as applicable or not applicable. Now, under many of the regimes, there are obligations to both collect initial margin and post initial margin. And so you see that reflected in these two columns, one dealing with Party A as a secured party, so dealing with their obligation to collect, and Party B's obligation to post. And also in the other column that talks about Party B as a secured party and its obligation to collect and Party A's obligation to post. Now, just to avoid any confusion, the way the intro is drafted may suggest that you would only be specifying those regimes to which you are directly subject as a secured party, but that's not in fact the case. You would want to specify the regimes that apply to both the posting and collecting obligations of either one or both of the parties. Now, take, for instance, a swap dealer who is subject to CFTC margin rules. Under the CFTC margin rules, they have both an obligation to collect initial margin and post initial margin. But a financial end user is not directly subject to those rules, so they would not have any direct obligations under the regulations. Nevertheless, in that situation, where the CFTC margin rules apply, you would want to specify CFTC as applicable in both columns. So there's various regimes that are included here. If the parties were interested in additional regimes, they might want to consult with legal counsel, because analysis was done across these regimes that there are generally certain principles that apply across the board, and therefore, these regimes can simply be turned on or turned off without changing too much throughout the rest of the credit support annex. The regimes that are included are EMIR, the U.S. rules, Canadian, Switzerland, Japanese, Australian, Hong Kong, and Singapore margin rules. Now, in the U.S., we've included here the prudential regulations, the CFTC regulations, and also the SEC regulations. And some might query why the SEC regulations have been included when they have not yet been finalized. Well, this agreement is designed to be somewhat future-proofed, and so under general principle BB, lowercase bb, the way this would work is even if you specified the SEC rules as applicable to the particular counterparty pairing, those rules would not apply until the relevant effective date of the party's obligations to post and collect under those rules. So you could specify the SEC margin rules as applicable to the relevant counterparty pairing, but they wouldn't go into effect, obviously, until those rules are finalized. One other thing to tie this all out, since we are, in some cases, saying that certain rules apply, even where a party is not directly subject to those rules, there is a disclaimer in this introductory paragraph, basically saying that this specifying whether or not a particular regime is applicable is not actually a representation or an admission that the party is actually regulated under that margin regime. And I think that's critical to completing this table. There's no, parties wouldn't want to have any sort of liability or potential for an event of default just by specifying a regime as applicable when it may or may not be applicable. So this is essentially just a contractual agreement to apply certain regimes. And as Mark mentioned, and which we'll get into later, these regimes, once specified, tie into how initial margin is calculated and how certain other calculations are made under the CSA.
Okay, so the next thing to be decided in the regime table is whether the parties are going to specify a SIM exception as applicable in respect of a regime. So just to give you a little bit of background on what this SIM exception is referring to, the initial margin regulations require parties to calculate their initial margin on the basis of either a model that meets the regulatory requirements or on the basis of specified standard percentages of notional known as grids. SIM, or the ISDA SIM, is an initial margin model that was developed by ISDA for the purposes of the initial margin requirements and has been broadly adopted. And so there is embedded in the ISDA documents an assumption that the parties will be using SIM to calculate their initial margin amount. But if the parties want to use the grid method for a particular regime, then they can do that by specifying a SIM exception as applicable. And if they do that, they may want to add some additional information. For example, they may be using the standard grids only for certain types of transactions, as opposed to all transactions for the particular regime. But as I said, if the parties simply specify that SIM exception is not applicable, then that means that SIM is going to be used to determine the initial margin amount for the trades subject to the particular regime. There are also a couple of fallback points here relating to SIM, and these recognize that in some regimes it is possible that whilst the model may be used at some point in time, that ability to use the model might be removed, in which case the parties would need to decide how they will deal with that under their documentation. In particular, the parties could include a fallback to mandatory method election, and that means that if a party notifies the other party that the regime requires the grids to be used for the types of transactions that are relevant, then it can unilaterally switch from the ISDA SIM to the grid. Another alternative exception is to elect that the mandatory method will apply for a particular regime, and that simply means that the grid will apply instead of SIM for that regime. Just to fill out the picture here, one last point we make is that whilst the regimes will typically be filled out in full for both collecting and posting obligations in the way that Ryan described earlier, it is possible that the parties may be subject or become subject to a regulatory requirement to post that they didn't include in the regime table. And in this case, there is general principle DD, which provides that if a pledgor is obligated to post under an initial margin regulation that's not specified as a regime in the table, then the secured party will use reasonable endeavors to accommodate pledgor's request to post the additional amount required.
And Mark, I would just highlight to the group that the default really here and the agreement amongst the working group was that SIM should be the applicable method for calculating initial margin. It's much less costly than utilizing the grid, and that's why this chart has been drafted in this manner, that you're really looking for some exception where it wouldn't work to utilize the SIM, either for regulatory purposes or for some other reason. But that's why the default is to have SIM apply when you specify a particular regime as applicable. Okay, now I wanted to talk a little bit about this concept of strictest of, which Mark alluded to earlier. And we've mentioned already a couple of general principles, but I should just note that a lot of the ways in which the grid, the regime table is designed to work is that the regime table is very simple, but all of the operative provisions are built into these general principles. And one of the general principles in calculating the margin amount IM, the initial margin that's required, is based on this strictest of principle. So to the extent that multiple regimes apply to a particular counterparty pairing, then you would want to look across all of those regimes to see which is the most onerous to satisfy. And so this plays out in a few different provisions. One for the margin amount IM, as I mentioned. So you would look across the various regimes and determine which regime has essentially the highest initial margin requirement. And to the extent that each of those regimes were to apply SIM, then you would just be looking across SIM and the various versions of SIM that apply with respect to the relevant regime. And so each might have approved a different version of SIM, and those calculations might be different under each of those versions. There's also the possibility that under one regime you'd specified SIM, and under another regime you'd specified grid, and in all likelihood it would probably be the grid that would be the higher amount, and so that amount would be the amount that would be included as the margin amount IM for purposes of the CSA. Similar principles would apply across valuation percentage and the FX haircut. And for valuation percentage, since that is calculated as a percentage of the value of a particular asset that's posted as collateral, in that case, you would be looking at the lowest valuation percentage that's permitted under the various regimes. For the FX haircut percentage, the strictest would essentially be the highest. So whichever regime had the highest FX haircut percentage, 8% in the United States, for instance. So the way this is designed to work from a documentation standpoint is that the parties would actually agree in a schedule, either a schedule to the CSA or a schedule to the relevant account control agreement where the initial margin is segregated. They would specify all of those valuation percentages and FX haircut percentages, and those percentages, whatever was agreed between the parties, would be subject to these regulatory requirements of the various regimes. So to the extent that the regime had something that was more strict than what was agreed between the parties, then that would be overridden. That stricter requirement would override what's in the agreed schedule between the parties.
So that brings us to the end of our description of the regime table, the regimes that parties can specify and how they are used in the documents. I'd like to thank Ryan very much for presenting with me today. If you have any further questions regarding this presentation or ISDA's initial margin documentation, please do contact us. You can see an email address to use on your screen. And with that, we will close there for today. Thank you very much for listening.